The candle burns low in the great chamber of Hampton Court Palace. It is nearly midnight on the second day of November, 1541. Beyond the lead-paned windows, England sleeps under a cold autumn sky. But here in this room, sleep is impossible. Catherine Howard sits alone at a wooden table, 18 years old. 5 months ago, she wore the crown of England as the fifth wife of King Henry VIII. The court called her the jewel of the realm. Foreign ambassadors praised her beauty and vivacity. She moved through the palace corridors like sunlight through stained glass, young and radiant, and seemingly untouchable. Tonight she is none of those things. Guards stand outside her door, not the ceremonial kind that bow and smile. These are soldiers with pikes and grim faces, men who have been told that the woman in this chamber is dangerous. Her ladies-in-waiting have been dismissed. The servants who once scrambled to fulfill her every wish now avert their eyes when they pass. The great machinery of the Tudor court, which elevated her so swiftly to its pinnacle, has begun the equally swift work of tearing her down. Through the thick stone walls, she can hear something that chills her more than the November cold. The King of England is weeping, Henry VIII, supreme, head of the Church of England, defender of the faith, the most powerful man in the realm, is somewhere in his private apartments, and he is crying like a child. The sound carries through corridors and chambers, impossible to ignore. It is not the quiet grief of a man mourning in private. It is loud, racking, theatrical. The king wants everyone to know his heart is broken. But Catherine knows better. She has learned in these past terrible hours that Henry's tears are not just sorrow. They are rage wearing the mask of grief. They are the preliminary performance before the final act of vengeance. The footsteps come then, not the gentle shuffle of servants, not the familiar rhythm of attendants she has known. These footsteps are deliberate, measured, heavy with authority and purpose. They stop outside her door. The knock that follows is not a request. It is a formality preceding an inevitability. Catherine rises from her chair. She does not tremble. Not yet. There will be time enough for fear in the days to come. Right now, there is only the cold certainty that everything she built, everything she dreamed, every moment of glory and triumph is about to be stripped away. The door swings open. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer stands in the threshold. He is 52 years old with the lean, ascetic face of a scholar and the cold eyes of a survivor. Behind him, 6 armed men fill the corridor, far too many for a simple conversation with a young woman. Cranmer's face wears an expression of compassion. His voice when he speaks is gentle, almost fatherly. "Your Grace," he says, and in those 2 words Catherine hears the future. Not "Your Majesty," "Your Grace." The subtle demotion has already begun. "His Majesty, the King, is grievously troubled." Cranmer continues, stepping into the chamber. "Certain matters have come to light, matters concerning your years before your marriage to His Majesty, and matters, God help us all, concerning your conduct after you took your marriage vows." He does not sit, does not make himself comfortable. This is not a friendly visit. He stands before her, and from within his robes, he produces a roll of parchment, not blank, already filled with names, dates, testimony, evidence. "Henry Mannix," Cranmer says, reading from the document. "Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper." He looks up at her and his eyes hold no warmth. "These names are familiar to you, I trust?" Catherine feels the room tilt slightly. Somewhere far away, Henry's weeping has stopped. The silence that replaces it is worse. Someone has talked. The secrets she buried in the shadows of the Duchess of Norfolk's house, in the chaos of her adolescent years, in the desperate nights when she sought comfort from a face she recognized, have clawed their way back into the light. Someone from her past has spoken to the Crown's investigators. Someone has given them names and dates and details. Cranmer places parchment, ink, and quill on the table before her. "His Majesty," the Archbishop says, "demands a full accounting. You may write it yourself or speak it aloud, but you will hold nothing back. We already possess testimony from several witnesses. If your statement contradicts what we know to be true, it will go worse for you. Do you understand?" Catherine understands. In Tudor England, when the Crown demands answers, there is only one wise course. Tell them enough to seem cooperative. Admit what they can already prove. And pray that what you conceal stays concealed. Cranmer does not leave. She does not use the crude words the court will use later. She keeps it vague, but not so vague they will accuse her of evasion. But she draws a clear, firm line. There was no promise of marriage, no contract. Francis may claim they called each other husband and wife, but it was the foolish endearment of young people, not a legally binding vow. She must deny this. If the crown believes there was a valid pre-contract between her and Derham, her marriage to Henry is void. And if the marriage is void, she is not a queen being accused of indiscretion. She is a commoner who deceived a king. The punishment for that is not imprisonment, it is death. Finally, she comes to Thomas Culpeper. Her hand hesitates. The ink pools at the tip of the quill. She knows they already know about the meetings. Too many people were aware. Lady Rochford, who arranged them. Servants who saw, but pretended not to. Palace guards who heard whispers. Catherine admits the meetings. She admits exchanged gifts and tokens. She admits long conversations. But she denies with every ounce of conviction she can summon onto the page that there was ever physical adultery. They talked. They reminisced about the days before she was queen. He was kind to her. That is all. It has to be all. Because if she admits to adultery after marriage, there is no mercy. Adultery by a queen is not just a sin. It is high treason. Treason means the scaffold and the axe. Cranmer reads what she has written in silence. His face reveals nothing. He rolls the parchment, carefully tucks it back into his robes, and leaves without another word. The guards close the door behind him. The lock turns with a sound like a coffin lid shutting. Catherine sits in the darkness and waits for dawn. She does not know yet that this is only the beginning, that the next 90 days will be a slow, grinding destruction more terrible than anything she can imagine. That the question is not whether she will die, but how many others will die with her. But to understand how an 18-year-old girl came to sit in a locked chamber at Hampton Court, writing a confession that will not save her, we must travel backward. Back to a childhood no one thought to record carefully. Back to a house where neglect and chaos created the conditions for catastrophe. Back to the moment when the Howard family decided that Catherine's youth and beauty could be weaponized in the most dangerous game in England, the game of controlling a king. England in the year 1540 is a nation balanced on the edge of a knife. 20 years have passed since King Henry VIII broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and began the most radical transformation of English society in centuries. The monasteries have been dissolved. Their lands, their wealth, their power redistributed to a new class of nobles who owe everything to the king's favor. But this transformation came at a cost. The cost is instability. In Europe, the Catholic powers watch England with hostile eyes. The Pope in Rome has declared Henry a heretic. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V could invade at any moment to restore England to the true faith. France under King Francis I plays a careful game of alliance and betrayal, sometimes friend to England, sometimes threat. Henry needs heirs, male heirs, sons who can secure the Tudor dynasty and prevent England from sliding back into the Civil War that tore the country apart in his father's time. The Wars of the Roses, when noble houses slaughtered each other for the throne, are still fresh in memory. Henry will do anything, sacrifice anyone to make sure his line continues. But God, it seems, has not cooperated. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter, Mary, but no living sons. Henry declared the marriage invalid, broke with Rome to do it, and married Anne Boleyn. Anne gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, and then miscarried a son. Henry had her executed on charges of adultery and treason in 1536. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally delivered a son, Edward, in October of 1537. But Edward is fragile, he is small, he gets sick easily, and Jane died 12 days after childbirth, leaving Henry with one sickly son and no wife. By 1540, Edward is 4 years old. He is the heir, but he has only one child. If he dies, the succession is in chaos. Henry needs more sons. He needs a new wife. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves in January of 1540 was a political disaster. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of the English Reformation, arranged the match to create an alliance with Protestant Germany. But Henry found Anne physically repulsive. He could not consummate the marriage. He blamed Cromwell for tricking him, for presenting a woman in portraits that made her look better than she did in person. In June of 1540, Cromwell was arrested. In July, he was executed. On the very same day, Cromwell's head was struck from his body, July 28, 1540. Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony. The timing was not coincidental. It was a message. The old order is dead. The new order begins now. But who chose Catherine Howard, and why? The answer lies in the great chess game of Tudor politics, where noble families maneuver for position and where placing the right woman in the king's bed can mean control over the entire kingdom. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, is one of the most powerful men in England. He is in his late 60s, a survivor of multiple reigns and political upheavals. He is a religious conservative, a man who supported the break with Rome because it gave him power, but who secretly wishes England would return to the old Catholic ways. He despises the Protestant reformers who surround the king. He especially despised Thomas Cromwell. When Cromwell fell, Norfolk saw his opportunity. The reformers had placed Anne of Cleves in Henry's bed. That marriage was a humiliation. Norfolk would do better. He would place his own blood on the throne. He would give Henry a young, beautiful, vivacious English bride who would make the king forget his disappointments. He chose his niece, Catherine Howard. Catherine was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, the Duke's younger brother. Edmund was a failure, poor, constantly in debt, unable to provide for his many children. When Catherine's mother died, probably when Catherine was around 7 or 8, Edmund did what impoverished nobles often did. He sent his daughter to live with a wealthier relative. Catherine went to live with the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, her step-grandmother, in the Duchess's sprawling London house. It should have been an opportunity. The Duchess ran a household where young women of good family were trained in music, needlework, courtly manners, and all the skills necessary to make good marriages. It should have been a sanctuary. It was not. The Duchess's house was K. Dozens of children and young people lived there, distant cousins and wards and dependents. During the day, there were lessons and supervision. After dark, the supervision vanished. The young women slept in a communal chamber called the Maiden's Chamber. It was supposed to be guarded, protected, sacred. Instead, it became a hunting ground. Young men from the household servants, clerks, minor gentlemen discovered they could slip into the Maiden's Chamber after nightfall. They came for the girls. Some came with sweet words and promises. Others came with demands and expectations. Derham came to the Maiden's Chamber at night. He brought gifts, small treasures, tokens of affection. They laid together in the narrow bed. They whispered secrets in the darkness. They called each other husband and wife. Under the law of England at that time, such promises, if spoken with genuine intent, before witnesses, could constitute a valid marriage contract. A pre-contract. And if a valid pre-contract existed, any later marriage was void. This legal technicality would become a weapon pointed at Catherine's throat. When Catherine left the Duchess's household in 1539 or early 1540, probably around age 16 or 17, to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, she thought her past stayed behind. She believed the secrets of the Maiden's Chamber would remain in the shadows where they belonged. She was wrong. Servants remembered. Other girls from the household remembered. They remembered the nights Derham came to Catherine's bed. They remembered the gifts. They remembered the whispered endearments. And in November of 1541, when the crown came asking questions, they told everything they knew. But before the catastrophe, there was triumph. In the early months of 1540, Henry VIII was miserable. His marriage to Anne of Cleves was a torment to him. He could not bear to touch her. He felt humiliated every time he had to appear with her in public. He blamed Cromwell. He blamed fate. He blamed God. And then he noticed Catherine Howard. She was 17, perhaps nearly 18. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a liveliness that made her seem to glow. She laughed easily. She danced beautifully. She was everything Anne of Cleves was not. And she was English. Tudor nobility, one of his own people. The Duke of Norfolk made sure his niece was always nearby when the king appeared, made sure she wore flattering gowns, made sure she smiled at Henry, but not too much, made sure she seemed both available and unattainable at the same time. Henry fell completely. By summer, the plans were in motion. The marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on the 9th of July, 1540. Anne, who was clever and valued her life, cooperated fully. She accepted a generous settlement, several estates, the title of the king's beloved sister, and her freedom. She would outlive Henry and all his other wives. On July 28, 1540, in a private ceremony, Henry VIII, age 49, married Catherine Howard, age 17. The age gap was 32 years. He was old enough to be her grandfather. The Duke of Norfolk's gambit had succeeded. His niece was Queen of England. The reformers were in disarray. Cromwell was dead. The conservative Catholic faction was ascendant. Henry showered Catherine with jewels, gowns, estates, titles. He called her his rose without a thorn. He threw feasts in her honor. He seemed for the first time in years genuinely happy. But Norfolk and his allies made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed Catherine's past was safely buried. They assumed the servants and girls from the Duchess's household would keep their silence. They assumed that in the vastness of England, in the chaos of a great noble house, no one would remember or care about the indiscretions of a teenage girl. They were wrong, and there was one more miscalculation, one more variable they did not anticipate. Thomas Culpeper. Thomas Culpeper was a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. This was not a ceremonial position. The Privy Chamber was the King's inner sanctum, his private apartments where he slept. 8 conducted confidential business. Only a handful of men, 6 to 8 at most, had access to this space. They dressed the king, attended him at his most intimate and vulnerable moments, carried his messages, listened to his thoughts. It was a position of immense trust and immense power. Henry liked Culpeper, trusted him, gave him gifts, lands, offices. Culpeper was young, handsome, educated, well-born. He was everything a king's companion should be, and Catherine Howard knew him. The exact nature of their prior relationship is lost to history. But when Catherine arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, she and Culpeper recognized each other. Perhaps they were distant relations. Perhaps they had met at some noble gathering. The sources do not tell us. What the sources do tell us is this. After Catherine became queen, she and Thomas Culpeper began meeting in secret. The meetings were arranged by Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn, widow of George Boleyn. George had been executed in 1536 alongside his sister Anne Boleyn on charges of incestuous adultery. Jane had survived that catastrophe, navigated the treacherous years that followed, and now served Queen Catherine Howard. Why did she arrange these secret meetings? The question has no certain answer. Some historians believe she was reckless, addicted to intrigue. Others suggest she genuinely wanted to help Catherine, who was isolated and overwhelmed by the demands of being queen. Still others whisper, though, there is no evidence that someone instructed her to facilitate these meetings. Someone who wanted Catherine to incriminate herself. The meetings took place at night in Catherine's private chambers or in unused rooms of the palace. Lady Rochford stood guard outside, warning if anyone approached. Catherine and Culpeper talked. They exchanged small gifts, letters, tokens of affection. Did they commit adultery? The historical evidence is contradictory and frustrating. Culpeper later confessed to intending to do ill with the queen, but he never clearly stated that physical adultery occurred. Catherine consistently denied it. But intent in the eyes of Tudor law was enough. For a queen to meet in secret with a man who was not her husband to exchange intimacies to feel affection was treason. If the man confessed to desiring adultery, that desire alone could send both of them to the scaffold. From a political perspective, the question of whether Catherine and Culpeper actually consummated their relationship is almost irrelevant. The appearance of impropriety was damning enough. And in a world where the queen's body was a vessel for the legitimate heir to the throne, even the possibility of adultery was a threat to national security. The meetings continued through the summer and into the autumn of 1541. How long could such a secret last in a palace filled with servants, courtiers, spies, informants, where everyone watched everyone else for advantage, where loyalty was purchased and betrayed daily? Not long. The unraveling began with a woman named Mary Lascelles, formerly Mary Hall. She had once been a servant in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. She had been there during Catherine's years in the Maiden's Chamber. She had seen things, heard things, remembered things. In the autumn of 1541, Mary Lascelles was married and living a quiet life. But she had a brother, John Lascelles. John was a committed Protestant reformer. He despised the Howard family and everything they represented. He saw the Duke of Norfolk's Catholic faction as a threat to the true religion. When Mary told her brother about Catherine Howard's past, about Henry Manox and Francis Derham, and the chaos of the Maiden's Chamber, John Lascelles saw an opportunity. Not to help Catherine, not to protect her, to destroy her, and through her to destroy the Howard family's power. John Lascelles took the information to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer faced a terrible dilemma. If he brought these accusations to the king and they proved false, Henry would destroy him. Henry had just executed Thomas Cromwell for the disaster of Anne of Cleves. If Cranmer brought another false accusation about another queen, his head would follow Cromwell's. But if the accusations were true and Cranmer concealed them and they later came to light, he would be guilty of concealing treason. That also meant death. Cranmer needed proof. Solid, undeniable, documented proof. He ordered quiet, careful investigations. The Tudor intelligence network went to work. They found Mary Lascelles and took her testimony in detail. They found other servants from the Duchess's household women who had shared the maiden's chamber with Catherine. They found witnesses who remembered Derham's nighttime visits. They built a case. On November 1st, 1541, All Saints' Day, Cranmer presented the evidence to the king. Henry's initial reaction was disbelief. Not as Catherine, not his rose without a thorn, not the girl who made him feel young again. It was a conspiracy by his enemies. But Cranmer had names, dates, testimony from multiple witnesses. He had details that could not be fabricated. And he had one more devastating piece of information. The Queen had given Frances Derham a position in her household after she became queen. Why would a woman give her former lover employment in the royal court unless she intended to resume the affair? To Catherine, hiring Derham probably seemed like the safest option. Keep him close. Keep him under control. Make sure he could not blackmail her or spread rumors. To Henry's investigators, it looked like proof of ongoing adultery. The king's disbelief turned to rage. His rage turned to self-pity. How could God let this happen to him again? How could another wife betray him? He ordered arrests. Henry Manox, Frances Derham, Thomas Culpeper, Lady Rochford, all taken into custody. The Duchess of Norfolk interrogated. Her servants questioned. And on the night of November 2nd, 1541, Archbishop Cranmer came to Catherine Howard's chambers with armed men and questions that would begin her destruction. The Tudor system of justice, when it concerned treason, was not designed to discover truth. It was designed to extract confessions and eliminate threats. There were no defense attorneys, no presumption of innocence, no right to remain silent. Once the crown decided you were dangerous, the machinery ground forward until you were dead or ruined. The interrogations began immediately. Henry Manox was questioned first. He had the least to lose. He was a commoner, a music teacher. He was not accused of treason, only of improper conduct with Catherine when she was young. He told the investigators everything. He described touching her sexually. He described how far their encounters went. He claimed he knew from the beginning that she was not a virgin. This testimony was devastating for Catherine. It painted her as sexually experienced from a young age. It contradicted Henry's belief that he had married an innocent, pure girl. It humiliated him. But Manox would not be executed. He was needed as a witness. He was imprisoned, briefly then released. His cooperation saved his life. Frances Derham was a different matter. Derham was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. There in the cold stone rooms beneath the fortress, he was questioned by the king's investigators. The exact methods used on him are not recorded, but the tower had tools and techniques for encouraging cooperation. Torture was legal in cases of treason. The rack which stretched a man's joints until they dislocated. The manacles which suspended a man by his wrists until his shoulders gave out. Sleep deprivation, starvation. The promise of mercy if you confessed, the threat of agony if you did not. Derham confessed. He described his sexual relationship with Catherine in detail. He admitted they had slept together regularly, that they exchanged gifts, that they called each other husband and wife. And then he made a critical claim. He insisted that their relationship constituted a binding marriage contract. Under English law, he said he and Catherine were married, which meant her later marriage to the king was invalid. The implications were staggering. If Derham's claim was true, Catherine had never legally been Queen of England. Any children she might have borne Henry would be illegitimate. She had committed fraud on a massive scale. But there was another implication that terrified Henry's advisors. If Catherine's marriage to Henry was void, then prosecuting her for adultery with Thomas Culpeper became legally complicated. You could not commit adultery against a marriage that did not exist. The solution was to reject Derham's claim, to declare that whatever happened between him and Catherine, it as teenagers, did not constitute a valid contract. She was foolish and sinful, but she had been legally free to marry Henry. which meant her subsequent relationship with Culpeper was definitely treason. Thomas Culpeper was interrogated separately with no knowledge of what Catherine or Derham had said. This was standard procedure. Keep the suspects isolated. Tell them contradictory stories. Make them uncertain about what the Crown knows and what it does not. Culpeper admitted the secret meetings. He admitted that Lady Rochford arranged them. He admitted exchanging gifts and messages with the Queen. And then he said the words that sealed both their fates. I intended to do ill with the Queen, and I believe she intended the same with me. He never explicitly confessed to physical adultery. The evidence suggests they may never have consummated their relationship, but under Tudor law, the intent was enough. A gentleman of the King's privy chamber, who desires the Queen's body, who meets her in secret, who imagines possessing what belongs only to the King, has committed treason in his heart. And treason of the heart was punished the same way as treason of the flesh. Now the Crown had three confessions: Mannix describing Catherine's sexual past, Derham claiming a pre-contract marriage, and describing their physical relationship. Culpeper admitting intent to commit adultery with the Queen. Catherine's written statement contradicted all three in crucial ways. She had minimized Mannix's behavior, denied any contract with Derham, insisted nothing improper happened with Culpeper. In Tudor justice, when contradictions arose, the Crown always chose the interpretation most favorable to conviction. On November 22, 1541, 20 days after Cranmer's midnight interrogation, the situation escalated. A delegation of lords and councillors from the King's Privy Council arrived at Catherine's chambers at Hampton Court. They did not knock gently. They entered with formal coldness. They addressed her as Your Grace, not Your Majesty. The Lord Chancellor read a statement. By order of the King and his council, Catherine Howard was stripped of her title as Queen of England. She was no longer to be addressed or treated as royalty. The marriage, while not yet formally annulled, was declared invalid in the eyes of the King. She would be moved immediately from Hampton Court to Sion Abbey, a former monastery on the banks of the Thames. There she would be held under guard while Parliament decided her fate. Catherine begged them to let her see the King. Just once. She would throw herself at his feet. She would confess everything. She would accept any punishment he chose. She only wanted to speak to him face to face one final time. The councillors refused. The King had no wish to see her. He was too aggrieved, too wounded by her betrayal. What they did not tell her was that Henry had given explicit orders. He would never see Catherine Howard again. He could not bear to look at the face that had deceived him. Catherine was given an hour to prepare. She was allowed a small household of servants, carefully selected by the Crown. Women who would watch her, report her every word, prevent any attempt to escape or harm herself. She was taken by barge down the Thames to Sion Abbey. It was a gray November day, cold and drizzling. The barge moved slowly through the dark water. Catherine sat in the vessel under guard, no longer a queen, not yet officially a prisoner, suspended in a legal and political limbo that would last for months. Sion Abbey had once been a wealthy Brigittine house home to nuns and monks who lived according to strict religious rules. But in 1539, as part of Henry's dissolution of the monasteries, Sion was seized by the Crown. Its religious occupants scattered its treasures, confiscated its buildings, converted for royal use. Now it served as a comfortable prison for people too important to throw into the Tower, but too dangerous to leave at liberty. Catherine was given chambers in the former abbess's quarters. They were well appointed, a bed with good linens, a fireplace, windows overlooking gardens. She had attendants to dress her and bring her meals. To an outsider, it might have looked like a pleasant country retreat, but every door had guards on the outside. Every window was watched. No one could visit without permission from the King's council. No letters could be sent or received. Catherine was cut off from the world, isolated, left to wonder hour by hour, day by day, whether she would live or die. The waiting was its own form of torture. Modern interrogation manuals recognize this tactic. Uncertainty is more psychologically damaging than certain doom. A prisoner who knows she will die tomorrow can prepare herself, make peace, find courage. A prisoner who does not know whether tomorrow brings execution or pardon lives in constant grinding anxiety. Catherine woke each morning unsure if this was her last day. She heard footsteps in the corridor and wondered if they came to announce her release or her death sentence. She studied the faces of her guards for clues about her fate, searching for signs of pity or contempt or indifference. Days became weeks. November turned to December. Still no official word about her future. Meanwhile, in London, the machinery of Tudor justice moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. On December 1st, 1541, Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were brought to trial at the Guildhall. The trial was a formality. The confessions had already been obtained. The verdict was predetermined. Both men were found guilty of high treason. The sentences reflected their different social statuses. Derham, who was not a gentleman by birth, received the full traitor's punishment. He would be hanged by the neck until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. His genitals would be cut off and burned before his eyes. His abdomen would be opened and his intestines drawn out. Finally, he would be beheaded and his body cut into 4 quarters. This was called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was the most brutal execution England practiced, reserved for traitors and those guilty of crimes against the crown. Thomas Culpeper, because he was a gentleman and had been a favorite of the king, was granted a mercy. He would only be beheaded. One stroke of the axe, a swift death. On December 10th, 1541, the sentences were carried out at Tyburn, the public execution ground west of London. Culpeper died first. He was brought to the scaffold, allowed to speak briefly to the crowd, then beheaded with a single blow. His body was taken down, wrapped, and later buried. Then Francis Derham was brought forward. The crowd watched as he was hanged, his feet kicking as he slowly strangled. Just before he lost consciousness, he was cut down. What followed was butchery. The executioners worked quickly, cutting away his genitals, slicing open his abdomen, pulling out his intestines while he was still alive and aware. Only then did the axe fall to end his suffering. His body was hacked into 4 pieces. His head, like Culpeper's, was mounted on a spike on London Bridge. This was standard procedure for executed traitors. Their heads were displayed on the bridge as a warning to anyone entering or leaving the city. The heads remained there exposed to weather and birds until they rotted away or were replaced by newer examples. At Sion Abbey, someone told Catherine what had happened. Perhaps a guard who thought she should know. Perhaps a servant who let the information slip. Perhaps the crown deliberately informed her to make sure she understood the consequences of defying the king. Catherine learned that Francis Derham, who had held her in the darkness of the maiden's chamber when she was 16, had been tortured to death in public. She learned that Thomas Culpeper, who had been kind to her, who had listened to her, who had made her feel seen and valued, had been beheaded as a traitor. She learned that their heads were rotting on spikes above London Bridge where everyone could see them. The psychological impact can only be imagined. Guilt, horror, the certain knowledge that men had died because of her and that she was next. But the crown was not finished. Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn had been arrested alongside the others. She was interrogated about her role in arranging the secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. Under questioning, her mental state deteriorated rapidly. Jane had already survived one catastrophic scandal. In 1536, she had been married to George Boleyn, brother to Queen Anne Boleyn. When Anne fell accused of adultery and incest with multiple men, including her own brother, George was arrested and executed. Some historical accounts, though, disputed claim Jane testified against them, or at least did nothing to help them. She had lived with that guilt and horror for 5 years. Now she was caught in another queen's fall, and her mind could not bear it. By late 1541, witnesses described Lady Rochford as raving, incoherent, unable to give clear answers to questions. She spoke in fragments. She wept uncontrollably. She seemed not to understand where she was or what was happening. Under English common law, there was a principle of mercy that dated back centuries. You could not execute an insane person. The reasoning was both practical and theological. Execution served multiple purposes. It punished the guilty. It deterred others. It allowed the condemned to make peace with God before death. If someone was insane, they could not understand why they were being killed. They could not repent. The execution lost its meaning. This principle now stood in the way of Henry's vengeance. He wanted Lady Rochford punished. She had facilitated the meetings. She had enabled the treason. But her madness protected her. Henry's solution revealed the extent of his power over English law. In February of 1542, a special act was rushed through Parliament. The act stated that henceforth insane persons could be executed for treason if they had been sane when they committed the crime. The execution could proceed regardless of their current mental state. Everyone understood exactly who this law was written for. It was a bill of attainder in all but name, a legislative act targeting one specific person. When news of this reached Sion Abbey, Catherine understood that no barrier, no legal principle, no ancient tradition of mercy would protect her. Henry controlled the law itself. He could change it, bend it, rewrite it to accomplish whatever he desired. If he could rewrite centuries of common law to execute one mad widow, he would not hesitate to do whatever was necessary to execute a disgraced queen. But while Catherine sat at Sion Abbey moving through the long gray days of December and January, the final legal mechanism was being prepared. Parliament had been summoned. The king's ministers had drafted a bill, not a bill to try Catherine Howard, a bill to declare her guilt by legislative act. It was called a Bill of Attainder. In a Bill of Attainder, Parliament does not hear evidence or debate guilt. It simply declares by majority vote that a person is guilty of a crime and subject to a specific punishment. There is no trial, no defense, no opportunity for the accused to speak. The bill is debated, voted on, and if it passes, it becomes law. The conviction is automatic. The English constitutional tradition despised bills of attainder. They were weapons of tyranny, ways for the powerful to destroy enemies without the inconvenience of proving their guilt. But when kings wanted someone dead and a trial might go wrong or create controversy, a bill of attainder solved the problem cleanly. Henry had learned from his mistakes with Anne Boleyn. Anne had been given a trial before the peers of the realm. She had been allowed to speak, to defend herself, to make a powerful final statement that some witnesses found convincing. Her trial created doubt, generated sympathy, sparked rumors that she was innocent. Henry would not make that mistake again. Catherine Howard would have no trial, no chance to speak, no opportunity to move hearts or create martyrs. Parliament would simply declare her guilty, and that would be the end of it. The Bill of Attainder against Catherine Howard was introduced in Parliament in early February 1542. It laid out the charges in clinical language. First, that Catherine Howard had engaged in vicious and carnal behavior with Francis Dereham before her marriage to the king. Second, that she had concealed this behavior from the king, thereby defrauding him and potentially corrupting the royal succession by leading him to believe she was a virgin when she was not. Third, that after becoming queen, and she had engaged in treasonous meetings with Thomas Culpeper, intending to commit adultery. The bill declared that all of this constituted high treason. The penalty was death. The bill also included a clause making future marriages of Henry VIII legal and valid. This was important. The king was already thinking about his sixth wife. He needed Parliament to officially clear the way. The bill passed both houses of Parliament quickly. This was not surprising. Very few members of Parliament were willing to vote against the king's will when his will was clear. To oppose the bill was to risk royal displeasure. It might suggest sympathy for a traitor. That suggestion alone could be fatal. On February 10, 1542, exactly 100 days after Cranmer's midnight interrogation, officials arrived at Sion Abbey with news for Catherine Howard. The Bill of Attainder had passed. She was formally convicted of high treason. She was sentenced to death by beheading. She would be taken to the Tower of London immediately. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a royal fortress, a weapons arsenal, a treasury, a mint where coins were made. It was also the place where high-status prisoners were held and, when necessary, executed. When nobles and royalty were condemned to death, they died at the Tower. Commoners and criminals died at Tyburn in public before screaming crowds. But queens died privately within the Tower walls on Tower Green, witnessed only by a small audience of officials and nobles. Catherine was told to prepare herself. She was given a little time to gather what few possessions she had been allowed at Sion. Then she was escorted to a barge waiting on the Thames. It was another cold, gray February day. The barge moved slowly downstream toward London. Catherine sat under guard, silent. The servants who attended her reported later that she seemed calm, almost resigned. 18 years old and already moving toward death with a kind of exhausted acceptance. As the barge approached London Bridge, Catherine would have known what waited above the roadway. Two heads on spikes, blackened and decomposing, the remnants of Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper. Whether she looked up at them or kept her eyes down, the sources do not say, but she knew they were there. The men who had been part of her life, now reduced to warnings, rotting above the river. The barge passed under the bridge and continued to the Tower's Watergate. The Watergate entrance at the base of the fortress walls was a low, dark archway. Later generations would call it Traitor's Gate, though that name was not yet in use in 1542. But everyone who entered through that gate knew what it meant. Queens came here to die. Anne Boleyn had passed through this gate in May of 1536, less than 6 years earlier. She had been held in the tower for 2 weeks, then executed on Tower Green. Her ghost, some said, still walked the fortress grounds. Now Catherine Howard climbed the stone steps from the barge into the Tower of London. The gate closed behind her. The journey was over. She was taken to chambers in the royal apartments within the tower. These were not dungeon cells. They were comfortable rooms with furniture, fireplaces, windows. Catherine had been a queen after all. Even condemned, she was due a certain level of accommodation. But make no mistake, she was a prisoner. The doors were locked from the outside. Guards stood watch day and night. She could go nowhere, see no one, send no messages, unless the crown permitted it. The air in the tower was heavy with history and death. The stones remembered. 4 years after Catherine Howard's execution, a German visitor to London wrote that the tower had a special smell. The smell of fear, of blood, of lives ending badly. Catherine was told that her execution had been scheduled. It would take place in 2 days. February 13th, 1542. 2 days to prepare for death. In those final 2 days, something extraordinary happened. Something that historians still debate and puzzle over. Something that reveals either Catherine's remarkable courage or her understanding of the only power she had left. She made a request. She asked that the execution block be brought to her chambers. She wanted to practice placing her head upon it. She wanted to rehearse the motions to train her body so that when the moment came, she would not fumble or hesitate or give the watching officials the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. The request was unusual. The officials were surprised, but they granted it. The wooden block, still stained from previous executions, was carried into Catherine's rooms. It was a low rectangular piece of wood with a curved indentation where the condemned person's neck would rest. Simple, functional, brutal. Catherine knelt beside it. Again and again she practiced, kneeling, placing her hands on the floor to either side, lowering her neck into the curve of the wood, finding the exact position that would make the executioner's job clean and quick, rising, repeating. Her attendants watched in horrified fascination. One of them later testified that Catherine seemed almost calm, as if she were rehearsing for a play rather than her own death. Why did she do this? Why spend her final hours practicing her own execution? Some historians interpret it as a desperate attempt to maintain dignity. She had been stripped of her title, her freedom, her future. This was the one thing she could still control. Not whether she would die, but how. She would die without fumbling, without needing the executioner to adjust her position, without giving her enemies any reason to mock her in death. Other historians see it as a political calculation. Catherine understood even at 18 that how she died would shape how she was remembered. If she died bravely, calmly, without breaking, perhaps history would be kinder to her. Perhaps people would see her as a victim rather than a villain. There is a third possibility, darker and sadder. Perhaps practicing the execution was the only way Catherine could process what was about to happen. Perhaps by repeating the motions over and over, she was trying to make the unthinkable seem real to accept the unacceptable. Whatever her reasons, she practiced through the night of February 12th. She slept little, if at all. She prayed with the chaplain assigned to her. She made her peace with God, or tried to. And when dawn came on February 13th, 1542, she was as ready as anyone could be. The morning was cold and overcast. Catherine was dressed in a dark gown, simple but well made. She was given time for final prayers. Then the guards came to her door. It was time. She walked from her chambers accompanied by guards and attendants. They moved through the tower's corridors, across courtyards, toward Tower Green. This was a small enclosed area within the tower walls, a patch of grass surrounded by buildings. Private. Controlled. Only about 200 people were present, all carefully selected. High officials, counselors, representatives of the major noble families, clergy. No common crowd, no public spectacle. This was an execution, but it was also a political statement. The crown was cleaning up a problem quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. A wooden scaffold had been built overnight. It stood about 4 feet high, accessible by a short flight of steps. On the scaffold waited the executioner, an axe in his hands. He had been brought from France specifically for this task. The English headsman was adequate, but the French executioners had a reputation for speed and precision. Henry wanted this done right. Catherine climbed the steps to the scaffold. The sources all agree on this. She did not stumble. She did not weep. She moved with careful control, every step deliberate. When she reached the top of the scaffold, she turned to face the small audience. Tradition required that condemned prisoners make a final speech. The speech was supposed to follow a formula. Acknowledge your guilt. Praise the king's justice. Ask the witnesses to pray for your soul. Do not protest your innocence or criticize your judges. Catherine spoke. Different witnesses recorded her words slightly differently, as always happens with oral testimony. But the substance was consistent. She said that she had offended VIII and the king. She said she deserved the punishment she was about to receive. She asked those present to pray for the king's long life and health. She asked for mercy for her soul. What she did not say was as important as what she did. She did not explicitly confess to adultery with Thomas Culpeper. She did not provide details. She accepted the sentence, but she did not give them the full confession they wanted. Even at the end, she held back one truth. Her voice was steady. Some witnesses said they were moved by her composure. Others interpreted her calmness as evidence of a cold heart, as proof that she had been guilty all along and was now accepting her just punishment. When the speech was finished, Catherine turned toward the block. This was the moment her practice was designed for. She knelt smoothly. She positioned her hands on the wooden platform exactly as she had rehearsed. She lowered her neck into the curved hollow of the block, adjusting her position until it was perfect. She stretched her arms out to the sides, the signal that she was ready. The executioner raised the axe. It was a heavy weapon, the blade sharp and polished. He had done this many times before. He knew the exact angle, the precise point of impact, the amount of force needed. The blade fell. One stroke. It was over. Catherine Howard's life ended at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on February 13th, 1542. She was 18 years old, possibly 19. The exact year of her birth had never been important enough to record carefully. Her body and her severed head were wrapped in cloth. Attendants carried them to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, the church within the tower walls. There beneath the floor, she was buried in an unmarked grave close to the remains of Anne Boleyn, the other wife Henry had executed. No monument was erected, no elaborate tomb, just the cold stone floor of a chapel, and beneath it the bodies of the king's discarded wives. But the mourning was not finished. Shortly after Catherine's execution, another prisoner was brought to the scaffold. Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn, widow of George Boleyn, the woman who had arranged the secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. Jane was still incoherent, still clearly suffering from severe mental distress. Witnesses described her as confused, struggling to understand what was happening. But the new law passed specifically to allow her execution meant her madness was no protection. She was beheaded on the same scaffold by the same executioner within an hour of Catherine's death. 2 women dead before noon, both casualties of Henry's marriages, both buried beneath St. Peter at Vincula, their graves unmarked for centuries. The double execution sent a clear message. The king's justice was swift and absolute. No one, no matter their status or mental state, was beyond its reach. And Henry himself, where was the king while his 5th wife and Lady Rochford were being executed? He was not at the Tower. He did not witness the deaths. He was elsewhere, continuing with the business of ruling England. There is no record of him speaking about Catherine Howard after her execution. No expressions of regret or second thoughts. Within months, he was pursuing another potential wife. Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed noblewoman in her 30s, educated and cautious. She would become Henry's 6th and final wife on July 12, 1543. Catherine Parr had the wisdom and experience that Catherine Howard lacked. She navigated the dangers of being Henry's wife successfully, and she outlived him. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, almost 5 years after Catherine Howard's execution. He died in his bed at the Palace of Whitehall, age 55, obese disease, suffering from infected ulcers on his legs. But he died as King of England, his power intact, his authority unquestioned to the end. He was succeeded by his son Edward VI, the boy from his third marriage to Jane Seymour. Edward was 9 years old. He reigned for 6 years before dying of tuberculosis at age 15. Then came Henry's daughter Mary from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She reigned 5 years. And finally, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had executed in 1536. Elizabeth I became one of England's greatest monarchs. She reigned from November 17, 1558 until March 24, 1603. 44 years of relative stability, cultural achievement, military victory. The daughter of an executed queen became the symbol of English power and pride. History has been unkind to Henry VIII in recent centuries. Modern audiences see a tyrant, a monster, a man who murdered wives and destroyed lives to serve his own desires. But to understand the fall of Catherine Howard, we must understand Henry not as a cartoon villain, but as a political leader operating within the brutal logic of 16th century monarchy. Henry needed a stable succession. This was not vanity, it was national security. England had torn itself apart in civil war within living memory. The Wars of the Roses had killed tens of thousands, destroyed noble families, created chaos and suffering on a massive scale. The Tudor dynasty existed to prevent that from happening again. To secure the succession, Henry needed sons, multiple sons in case one died. Edward was sickly. If Edward died without heirs, England faced a succession crisis that could easily slide into civil war. From Henry's perspective, Catherine Howard's past and her possible adultery with Thomas Culpeper were not just personal betrayals. They were threats to the kingdom. If Catherine had been pregnant when the scandal broke, and if there was any doubt about the child's paternity, that child's claim to the throne would be tainted. Enemies of the Tudors, both domestic and foreign, would seize on that doubt to justify rebellion. Henry's brutality had a purpose. It was not random or insane. It was the calculated cruelty of a man who believed he had to destroy anyone who threatened the stability he had built. That does not make it right. But it explains why a king who could be charming, intelligent, and cultivated could also sign death warrants for wives who displeased him. The men who died in the Catherine Howard affair understood this logic. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were not innocent bystanders. Derham had slept with a woman who later became queen, creating doubt about her suitability for that role. Culpeper had met secretly with the queen, confessed to desiring her, and thereby threatened the integrity of the succession. In the harsh calculus of Tudor politics, these men were security threats. Their deaths were not personal revenge. They were prophylactic executions, eliminating anyone who knew dangerous secrets or could cast doubt on the legitimacy of future royal children. Lady Rochford's execution is harder to justify even by these standards. She was clearly insane at the time of her death, but she had facilitated treason, and more importantly, she knew details that could be embarrassing or damaging if they became public. Silencing her permanently was, from the Crown's perspective, the safest option. The Bill of Attainder, used to condemn Catherine Howard, had consequences that reached far beyond one young woman's death. It established a precedent that the English Parliament could convict someone of a capital crime by simple legislative act, without trial, without the accused being present to defend herself. This precedent troubled English legal thinkers for centuries. It was recognized as a dangerous weapon, a tool that kings could use to eliminate enemies without the inconvenience of proving guilt. When the American Founding Fathers drafted the United States Constitution in 1787, they included a specific provision forbidding bills of attainder. Article 1, Section 9 states clearly, "No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed." The founders had studied English history. They knew about the Tudor monarchs. They knew how Henry VIII had used bills of attainder to destroy Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and many others. They knew these legislative convictions were tyranny disguised as law. So they banned them. The Catherine Howard case, along with other Tudor atrocities, directly influenced the constitutional protections Americans now take for granted. The law passed to allow Lady Rochford's execution, despite her insanity, remained on the books in England for over 200 years. It was not formally repealed until the 19th century. Generations of English people lived under a legal system that said the Crown could execute you even if you were too mad to understand why you were dying. This, too, was part of Catherine Howard's legacy. Her death and the legal mechanisms created to accomplish it shaped the evolution of English and American law in profound ways. There is one more story associated with Catherine Howard though it falls into the category of legend rather than verified history. At Hampton Court Palace, there is a long gallery that connects the royal apartments. In Catherine's time, this gallery would have provided a private passage for the queen to walk from her chambers toward the king's rooms. According to legend, in the days after Catherine's first interrogation by Cranmer, but before she was sent to Sion Abbey, she managed to break free from her guards. She ran through this gallery toward Henry's apartments, screaming his name, begging to see him. The guards caught her before she reached Henry's door. They dragged her back to her room, still crying out, reaching toward the king she would never see again. For centuries afterward, visitors and staff at Hampton Court have reported hearing a woman screaming in that gallery, footsteps running, doors slamming, a sense of panic and desperation soaking into the very walls. The gallery is now called the Haunted Gallery. Whether the ghost stories are true is impossible to verify. Paranormal claims are by their nature unprovable. But what is historically certain is this: a young woman, desperate and terrified, did try to reach the king. She did believe that if she could only speak to him face to face, throw herself at his feet, he would forgive her. She did not know yet that Henry had already made his decision, that he would never see her again, that mercy was not an option he was considering. The legend of the Haunted Gallery is powerful not because it might be true in a supernatural sense, but because it captures an emotional truth. Catherine Howard's voice was silenced in life. She was not given a trial where she could speak. She was condemned by legislative act, executed with bureaucratic efficiency, buried without ceremony. But her scream echoes through history. Her desperation, her fear, her futile hope for mercy, these cannot be erased. She was a vessel for the king's need for heirs. Her own desires, her own safety, her own future were never the priority. When she became inconvenient, when she became a potential source of embarrassment or doubt about the succession, the machinery of Tudor justice ground her into dust with ruthless efficiency. The men who died because of her Mannix Derham Culpeper were not innocent either. Mannix abused his position of authority over a child. Derham's relationship with teenage Catherine may have seemed consensual to them, but it took place in an environment of massive power imbalance and zero adult supervision. Culpeper confessed to desiring the queen's body, which in Tudor terms was treason, even if desire never became action. But the punishments they received, especially Derham's horrific public torture and execution, were designed not just to punish them, but to terrorize everyone else. The heads on London Bridge were not about justice. They were about power. They were a warning. This is what happens when you threaten the king's authority. The real horror of the Catherine Howard story is not the execution itself. Executions were common in Tudor England. The real horror is the 90 days between Catherine's first interrogation and her death. 90 days of psychological torture. 90 days of not knowing whether each dawn would be her last. 90 days of watching everyone connected to her be dragged into the machinery of royal justice. She was 18 years old. She should have been planning her life, bearing children, learning to navigate the complex world of the court. Instead, she spent 3 months waiting to die, knowing that men had been tortured and killed because of her knowing that more people would suffer, knowing that her own family had abandoned her to save themselves. And at the end of those 90 days, she climbed the scaffold steps and placed her head on the block with the calm control of someone who had practiced the motions over and over until they became mechanical. That image, Catherine Howard kneeling beside the execution block in her rooms at the Tower, rehearsing her own death, practicing the exact positioning so she would not fumble when the moment came, is perhaps the most haunting image from the entire Tudor period. It speaks to incredible courage, or incredible despair, or perhaps both at once. In the centuries since Catherine Howard's execution, she has been remembered in different ways. To Victorian moralists, she was a cautionary tale about the dangers of sexual immorality. To 20th century feminists, she was a victim of patriarchal violence. To contemporary historians, she is a complex figure whose choices and circumstances defy simple categorization. But perhaps the most important question is not what we think of Catherine Howard. It is what her story teaches us about power justice and the mechanisms by which societies destroy inconvenient people. The Tudor system of justice was not an aberration. It was not uniquely cruel by the standards of its time. Every European monarchy operated on similar principles. The king's will was law. Treason was defined as whatever threatened the king's power. Punishment was designed to terrorize as much as to punish. What makes the Tudor period distinctive is not its brutality, but its efficiency. Henry VIII and his advisors developed a sophisticated apparatus for identifying threats, extracting confessions, manipulating legal procedures, and eliminating enemies while maintaining a veneer of legality. They did not simply murder people in dark corners. They used bills of attainder parliamentary acts, carefully stage-managed trials and executions. They created legal precedents and bureaucratic procedures. They built a system, and that system, that machinery of state power disguised as justice, is the real legacy of Catherine Howard's death. When we ask whether Henry VIII was justified in executing his fifth wife, we are asking the wrong question. Justified by what standard? The law. He controlled the law. Morality, whose morality? National security. That was his justification, and by the logic of his time, it was not absurd. The better question is this: should any leader, any government, any system have the power to change laws retroactively to execute specific individuals? Should any system allow conviction without trial punishment based on intent rather than action, the destruction of the mentally ill for administrative convenience? The founding fathers of the United States, studying Tudor history, said no. They built constitutional protections specifically to prevent American governments from using the tools Henry VIII used against Catherine Howard. Those protections are not perfect. They have been challenged, eroded, reinterpreted over centuries. But they exist because people looked at what happened to Catherine Howard and others like her and said, never again. Not here, not in this country. That is Catherine Howard's true legacy, not her title, not her brief moment of glory as queen, not even her execution. Her legacy is the determination born from horror at her fate to build legal systems that cannot be bent so easily to destroy inconvenient individuals. She was 18 years old. She was flawed, reckless, probably foolish. She was also neglected, abused, manipulated, and sacrificed to the political ambitions of men who cared nothing for her welfare. She deserved better. She deserved protection as a child. She deserved guidance as a young woman. She deserved a fair hearing as an accused person. She deserved mercy as a human being facing death. She received none of these things. But in dying in the manner of her death, in the cold efficiency with which the Tudor state destroyed her, she became a symbol, a warning, a reminder of what governments can do when they prioritize power over justice, security over mercy, efficiency over humanity. The candle that burned low in her chamber at Hampton Court on that November night in 1541 was finally extinguished on a cold February morning in 1542 on a scaffold in the Tower of London. But the light of her story, the lesson it teaches, continues to burn. It illuminates the darkest corners of political power. It shows us how systems can devour individuals. It reminds us why we need laws that protect the weak from the strong, the accused from the accuser, the inconvenient from the powerful. Catherine Howard was the fifth wife of Henry VIII. She was Queen of England for less than 2 years. She died at 18, abandoned by her family, condemned without trial, her voice silenced. But history remembers her, not as Henry wanted, as a cautionary tale about the punishment for treason, but as a testament to the cost of unchecked power. She deserved better than she received. And so, we must build systems that ensure no one else suffers as she did. Systems with trials and evidence and the right to speak in your own defense. Systems that cannot be bent and twisted to serve the will of the powerful. Systems that treat even the accused, even the guilty, even the inconvenient as human beings deserving of basic dignity. That is the final lesson of Catherine Howard's 90 days. Justice delayed may be justice denied. But justice rushed, justice predetermined. Justice conducted without mercy or fairness is not justice at all. It is simply power. And power unchecked, as Catherine Howard learned in the last terrifying months of her short life, is the most dangerous force human societies can create.